Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Jonathan Anomaly. Jonathan is the academic director of the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics in Quito, Ecuador. He also is working with a company right now that is doing embryo selection for disease traits and cognitive traits as well. So you are a very interesting character in that you're involved in, your research and your philosophical writings are sort of beginning to challenge a lot of tenets of liberalism that we currently sort of take for granted in our society. And of course, your interest in biology and in trait selection, embryo selection as well, creates an interesting loop back on the political implications that are coming out of new developments in science and technology, which is why I wanted to have you on the show. But I came across an essay of yours that you provided called Enlightened Tribalism. And so the main topic of today is just going to be your more political philosophical writings on tribalism and its relationship to liberalism. So to get started, why don't we just begin by talking about tribalism as such? And this is sort of a word it's gotten a bad rap in our current society and culture. It's almost derogatory at this point, but it has an interesting socio-historical relationship to the development of liberalism, in particular, liberalism's emphasis on individualism. But it turns out that there might be some trade-offs that we have to consider along the way as we move towards a more universalist or cosmopolitan like society. And so to just get us kicked off here, what do you mean by tribalism, and what is the idea of enlightened tribalism?
Yeah, well, good question. I don't have any special definition. As you said, we tend to have a kind of negative connotation, or the word tends to have a negative connotation, at least in the late 20th and early 21st century. And that's probably pretty obviously because of World War II and its consequences, seeing, the more extreme forms of nationalism bleed over into global conflict, holocausts, that sort of thing.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, more generally, what is tribalism? It's a way, as Alan Buchanan says, of dividing the world into us and them.
Mm.
And there's no more natural way of doing things. We do this between ourselves as members of families. So there's us, the family, and then there's them. There's the non-family. There's the community, our community, and then there are other communities. And so in this sense, nothing could be more natural and more common. We all kind of understand what it is. And the only real question is, what are the good and bad forms of it? I mean, you think about sports, we're recording this right after the attempted assassination of President Trump. And, the next day there were a bunch of people just watching football games, right? Colombia
Mm.
versus Argentina and Spain versus England. They're moving on with their lives. This is much more exciting to them, right? Watching their nation compete against other nations in a football match. And it shows you just how deep and yet how obvious and ubiquitous tribalism is. So yeah, it's a way of dividing the world into us and them. And there are good and bad forms of it. And by good and bad, I mean more or less forms that are innocuous, that tend to have more or less good consequences for certainly us within the tribe and possibly for people outside the tribe. And then there are kinds that are, let's call it negative sum rather than zero or positive sum, where basically the form of tribalism we're involved in will involve annihilating other tribes. And that is a very common form of it. I mean, that's what Islam did.
Mm.
It's still doing it to some extent.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to make some distinctions here.
Okay. So tribalism gets a bad rap. There are good and bad forms of it that manifest. It's generally frowned upon. I remember I had a really bratty professor in college who I was sitting in her office hours for some reason. I think we were like required to go, and she told me one time that she thought that she hoped that football would one day be eliminated from the university because
Hmm.
she felt like football was a form of like practice for war, and that's what the men were doing playing football, and that
Yeah.
therefore we had to get rid of it. And your analogy or sort of the stark contrast between the attempted assassination of President Trump and the football fans who are going to watch, in this case, a soccer. I was referring to American football, but a soccer match the next day, it just kind of like reminded me of that incident of sort of the origin, the deep evolutionary origins of tribalism, which is literally banding together to cooperate better, share resources, fight other tribes, etc.
Good. Yeah. And that's the ultimate origin. I guess I could have said that at the beginning. I mean, Darwin, and really anyone who thinks like a Darwinian understands right away that we evolved these capacities and dispositions to act collectively as a tribe and to make distinctions between our tribe and another tribe precisely because it was necessary to facilitate collective action. Most people who think about evolutionary biology, Dawkins is probably the only one left who's an outlier. Most people now think group selection is one force among several in evolutionary biology. So what are the units of selection in evolutionary biology? Well, there's the individual gene, right? Ultimately, that is the immortal coil, as Dawkins calls it. That's the thing that survives or doesn't survive. And then genes, of course, as units of selection, form organisms. You know, the organism is itself a target of selection. You know, are you handsome enough? Are you smart enough? Are you tough enough for a female to pick you to have, you know, to reproduce with, or to survive a war, let's say, or to gather resources? And then there's the group. And Darwin really emphasized group selection quite a bit in The Descent of Man. He sort of said, I wish I had the quote in front of me. He said something like this: look, within groups, altruism is selected for. But between groups, actually, let me reverse that. Sorry. Within groups, selfishness can sometimes be selected for and even survive, which is why psychopaths sometimes thrive within groups as long as they're small in number. But between groups, when you think about them from a distance, if they're geographically isolated, groups of altruists tend to be groups of purely selfish people. Why is that? Because altruists within the group, right? Tribalists, that is, people who put aside their own identity, at least sometimes, and sacrifice their own interests sometimes for the sake of their group, they're going to tend to act collectively better. They're going to fight better wars. They're going to be better hunters. And they're going to ultimately reproduce groups of purely selfish, non-cooperative people. And so you have these interesting forces. On the one hand, your individual genes lead you to behave a bit selfishly sometimes, right? I mean, if you can have one more offspring than the guy next to you, you know, you're going to take those opportunities typically. But then again, if you can suppress that within a group, it starts usually with culture, religion, sets of moral rules, etc. If you can suppress that pure selfishness within the group and then evolve dispositions like guilt and shame and all of these things that are really ultimately evolutionary solutions to the problem of selfishness, those groups tend to do better than the groups of selfish people. So again, groups of altruists, generally speaking, groups of patriots, groups of people who prefer their own kind, their own religion, tend to outcompete those selfish individualists, those groups of selfish individualists. So
Yeah, I remember many years ago, back when I first read the Selfish Gene, discovering the punctuated equilibria that exist in many, like I guess what it would be like gene frequencies. But you're sort of describing a different equilibria of sort of the ratio of altruism to selfishness inherent in a group, and that needing to balance out with the survival of the individual, and then to the extent that the individual survival is dependent on the group survival.
Yep.
You know, there's this interesting interplay here.
Exactly. And so what does gene culture coevolution tend to do? At least when groups are isolated. Now we're in a very different environment now, and we'll get to that. This is the real implication of the paper is
Yes.
pretty subversive to the modern political order. But thinking about our distant, past, and in many cases for Europeans, we're really thinking 10,000 years ago, or at least a couple thousand years ago, when people tended to live a more tribal life. What was the reason that we had these instincts for patriotism, for discriminating, again, religiously, ethnically, linguistically, right? Sometimes you'll accept people who look very different than you within your group, even ethnically different. But what do you share? You share the same religion. That's what Islam does. That's what Christianity purports to do. Or you share the same language. And so we have these different overlaps, but what is the function of all of this? And I think it's really important that you brought it up. It
So
was to facilitate collective action.
so we
But
have this,
yeah,
we sort of set up the problem in terms of uh, framing tribalism as a part of our evolutionary inheritance. It's there
an
for some kind of,
adaptation, essentially. Yeah.
yes, it's there for some kind of reason. And this is sort of to begin countering arguments that tribalism can be eradicated or should be eradicated. And then begin to sort of discuss the shape of tribalism, in our evolutionary past and how it relates to where we are now. And this is sort of beginning to get into the question of morality itself. And so what you're basically describing is altruism and tribalism as sort of two ends of the spectrum for a kind of group level moral reasoning. Um,
Yeah.
and evolutionary anthropology has different theories about why morality emerged. My understanding of the literature is that morality is generally thought to have been a an in-group adaptation in order to increase groups' competitiveness. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out what is the best way to, like, inside of the context of the conversation, bridge the gap to modern day, because we have to sort of like fast forward from deep evolutionary time to
Yep.
cosmopolitan liberalism. I'd say one way of thinking about cosmopolitan liberalism is you have sort of altruism, you have sort of runaway altruism. Some people have called it pathological altruism or suicidal altruism. We end up developing these institutions and these societies that are based on an altruism dominant strategy. Is that how you would think about the development of cosmopolitan liberalism?
Sure. I mean, let's do a little more armchair anthropology. It's more than armchair. I mean, it's not as though we haven't read anything here or seen evidence for these theories, but it's a bit of armchair anthropology in the sense of just doing a quick 100-year scan of what's happened. I mean, think of what was going on in Europe in particular, but also East Asia, Japan, China, over the last roughly 200 years, starts especially mid 19th century. You get this movement toward nationalism in Europe. I mean, look, the idea of nationalism is a lot older than that, of course. The Persians, the Greeks had it, but it became really a kind of quite explicit theory, and it wasn't necessarily along the left-right divide. It was just the idea that, France is for the French and, French first, that kind of thing. And I mentioned France for a reason. I mean, it starts among the Germanic tribes in Germany and France and England.
And they
And
all
you
have
see
to
the
have
nations.
preceding unification movements of
Exactly.
previously warring and fractious groups.
Exactly. And you recognize, well, but this group is kind of like me. We share an ethnicity and a religion typically and a language or at least clusters of language that are sufficiently similar, right? So you get this move, toward nationalism, and it was very powerful, as you know. I mean, Japan, Germany, England, France, I mean, these became incredibly powerful nations, and their leaders appealed to their collective identity, right? As the Germanic people or as the French people or whatever, Japanese people. So, we get this move toward nationalism. It's obviously powerful. It actually does help unify the people, right? It can lead to more trust within the group, more peace, and therefore more commerce, more effective fighters if you're in a war, whether it's offensive or defensive. Appealing to nationalism is a pretty good way of recruiting soldiers who are willing to die for their country out of pure love. It really is a kind of altruism, as opposed to having to bribe people, which has also been done throughout history, right? You
Yeah.
literally just pay people who don't even care about your empire to fight. Well, what's the
Mercenary
probability?
armies have
Yeah,
notorious
exactly.
downsides.
Mercenary armies. Yeah. And now we're actually moving back toward this. We'll get back to the nationalism point in a second, but think of what's going on in the US right now as nationalism is being sort of stamped out, or the government's attempting to do that. And, we've got a more multiracial, multicultural, multilinguistic society. Who's going to volunteer for the army, and who's going to go for what reasons? Now we're more or less, we're back down to bribing people. It's not mercenaries exactly, but it's
Mm,
like, look, we're just going to take whoever's willing to do this for whatever the market rate suggests that they'll do it for. And it's just obvious to anyone who has looked at history, that's not going to get the kind of fighters you would get when instead you're promoting love of country, religion, people, etc. So anyway, fast forward to the obvious cases and nationalism going awry in World War I, World War II. There are many other examples, but those are the two most prominent. I mean, World War I is unbelievably destructive and sets the seeds for World War II. I'm not going to go through the history. And we see really the worst forms of nationalism. I mean, apart from the Holocaust, which is itself a kind of singular event and tragedy because so many million people were sort of killed very quietly behind the scenes. I mean, look at what nationalism did just from the standpoint of Germans. Did it help the
mm,
Germans or did
yeah.
it hurt them? And it's
Did it
it's
improve
very
the German
obvious.
stock?
Yeah, exactly. If you were just trying to maximize, the German stock or the Japanese stock,
Mm,
it's very obvious nationalism not only resulted this kind of nationalism in this outward aggression that harmed a lot of people on the outside, but it was suicidal for the Germans and for the Japanese. And when you look at not only their demographics right now, Japan is shrinking very rapidly right now, but just look at the way it indirectly influenced the culture. And this is the transition here. The response to World War II, although there were some seeds of this, the League of Nations in response to World War I as well, right? But World War II really isolated this problem. Like nationalism can become pathological in the sense that it both destroys outside groups that really do have a right to exist and can be suicidal if you get this kind of runaway nationalism. And therefore, what we're going to do, is form the United Nations and sign people up to a bunch of trade treaties and ultimately the European Union and so on, and make ourselves so interdependent through
mm,
trade, through immigration, through other things. These weren't necessarily bad intentions. I think quite the opposite, at least at the beginning. We're going to make ourselves so interdependent that we're not going to go to war with each other anymore. We're going to eradicate this really nasty tribal impulse that really did lead to World War II, which is a terrible event for all parties.
mm.
The Germans, the Jews, the Japanese, the English, the Americans. There were no winners in World War II, basically. It's just everyone loses. And I think now I'll get to the controversial part. We're still losing, and we're losing much harder now because we inherited these institutions that pathologized the impulse behind nationalism, and that is tribalism. And
There's
I think
a
to our detriment. So
yes. So now we're kind of getting into sort of the main strategies that liberals have proposed for escaping or eradicating tribalism,
yeah.
and kind of why they're more or less doomed to fail. Um, it's difficult making this argument to people outside of those who are reading the paper or maybe not as familiar with the stage, because to me, when I was reading it, everything was so obvious that I was almost like what is supposed to be happening? I mean, I told a friend of mine, I said, "Oh yeah, I'm preparing for the show and I'm reading this paper on enlightened tribalism." And then I described to her what it was, and she's like, "Isn't that just what everybody does?" And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm like, "No, like you don't understand. There's people that are not like this." But um, so basically, what you described to me is that there's a set of institutions that come about as a response to World War I and World War II that are trying to sort of put us in a place where tribalism cannot really come to the fore. And the sort of three methods that you suggest in the paper for, um, that evo liberals have for eradicating tribalism are moral bioenhancement, um, socioeconomic enhancement, and institutional bypass. And socioeconomic enhancement and institutional bypass are sort of related. Sort of basically, the gist of it is sort of like this global global trade, economic interdependence, commerce will sort of force us to not have any tribal qualities, because it's always just in the interest of, growing GDP or whatever to not indulge those. But it turns out that all of these methods have sort of their own pitfalls. And maybe we don't have enough time to go through each one individually, or maybe briefly we
Yeah.
can go through each one.
I can summarize the main points here if you like.
Sure. But I just wanted to say that sort of leading out of this, we're realizing that there are some inherent limits to what's going on with cosmopolitanism, and why it's not sort of long-term stable. So if you'd like, we can go through each of those three suggestions briefly,
Sure.
and then maybe why they don't work, and
Yeah,
then
let me
move
first
into
say,
sort of
yeah, you had mentioned, you're talking to a friend about this. Isn't it obvious? Well, tribalism is obvious. I mean, everyone knows it's an inherent feature. We already talked about examples in politics. Tribalism is what led to the aforementioned assassination attempt, I assume, unless it was some kind of whatever, three-letter agency doing it. But typically, you don't need one of those agencies. You just get people riled up enough, and they'll willingly sacrifice their own life, in order to take down what they consider to be evil. So we see tribalism, in sports, in politics, and religion, and so on. That's obvious. But I would say enlightened tribalism, with an emphasis on the first word, is not obvious. And that's to say something like this. The point of the paper is to say, look, there are bad forms of tribalism, and they can become destructive for the reasons we just mentioned in the wars and so on. Or the war of conquest that Islam engaged in, where they basically destroyed a beautiful culture, which is to say Spain, and took it over for nearly 1,000 years. So we all understand that, but the point of enlightened tribalism is to say, at least those of us who think about institutions, which is not the majority of people, but think about the optimal design of institutions, and political philosophies about what we should be aiming toward, right, in the normative moral sense. Those kinds of people should be aware, like, look, there are ways of fostering the kinds of symbols, mythologies, and frankly irrational or emotional parts of our nature in the service of a nation or of a country. You can do that in a way that's either destructive of yourself or other tribes, or in a way that's actually quite harmonious with them. And so we think, look, enlightened tribalism is this idea that you can be aware of the importance of tribalism. You can self-consciously prefer your tribe over others and think this is morally right to do this, while nevertheless, keeping history in mind and recognizing, but we should cooperate with other tribes, especially through trade. But we should also be aware, like, don't become too dependent on trade with them, because they might exploit you, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I think there's some degree to which we can, at least some of our leaders, in a sane and a just society, can be aware of what they're doing, aware of the value of symbols and mythology and so on, and not try to stamp that out as liberalism does. But nevertheless, also be on guard against kind of excessive tribalism. So it's a kind of middle way. It's a kind of Aristotelian golden mean. But yeah, let me go through really quickly. I don't want to talk too long in between breaks, but you mentioned, there's three ways in which we say liberal cosmopolitans propose extending altruism outward indefinitely. And I think all of them are bound to fail. So one is the idea of institutional bypass. That actually says not so much that we're going to extend altruism, but that we don't necessarily need it in all domains. So institutional bypass is this idea that when we rely on the market mechanism, we can we don't have to promote tribalism or altruism. We can just have these kinds of impersonal, systems of trade. It makes us all better off, et cetera. And maybe it makes us nicer. Some people have said that. We think this is a bit of a mistake. I mean, to some extent, it's right. We should use the impersonal mechanism of the market, both within and between countries. But we also think that ultimately it will lead some to get exploited by others if they don't prefer their own nation. And we're seeing that right now between us and China. I mean, why did Trump get elected ultimately? It's probably not for all of the reasons that, elites say it is. I mean, some of it's pretty banal, like West Virginians who voted 60-40 for Obama and then 70-30 for Trump.
Mm.
Like, did they just change their views about race? Like, maybe, but I doubt it. A lot of them just lost their jobs to China. And they're
Yeah.
like, what the fuck? Like, the Chinese don't play by the same rules we do. Screw them. Like, some of it was really simple stuff like that. And so they're intuitively getting this idea that you can't just bypass this issue and sort of say, oh, don't worry about altruism here. We're just going to rely on this market to allocate resources. It'll make us all better off. Governments design markets, and some of them do it better than others. And the Chinese are like the perfect example of relying on free trade when it benefits them and exploiting the shit out of other people when it benefits them.
Mm.
Meanwhile, our leaders are like, well, oh, we can't impose a tax or a subsidy that's against free trade.
Right.
Well, that's that's the reason that institutional bypass is not a real solution to this problem. It actually exacerbates it.
Mm.
There are two others though, and I'll mention them quickly and why they don't work. One is the idea of cultural enhancement, so to speak, or culturally promoting altruism. And I do think this works to some extent. It's obvious that it can. Like, why do people even care about words like sexism or racism? It's kind of odd, right? That these words are brand new. They didn't exist 100 years ago, or roughly 100, maybe it was 120 years ago, whenever they were invented. And suddenly it's like the worst thing you could possibly be. It's a
Yeah.
really strange thing. Or
There's no
just,
outgrouping allowed.
yeah, exactly. Or religion, the same thing for religion. And I'm not making a moral comment. I'm just like looking at history. Like, this is just bizarre. We have this anomaly where suddenly the only thing that matters is not prioritizing your group, whereas most of human history was the opposite.
Mm.
I think this has limits, and it's fairly obvious that we've been pushing up against those limits for a long time. Look at polls throughout the entire Western world after World War II, and even with a lot of people drinking the Kool-Aid, and some of that Kool-Aid was worth drinking, by the way, right? Like, let's treat other groups with respect. Like, that is definitely something we should do. And France, Germany, like, maybe you shouldn't look at each other as just mortal enemies, just constantly trying to expand territory. Maybe you should trade peacefully and chill out a bit, right? But this turned into like, okay, we have to treat everyone in the world as equally valuable,
Mm.
even if they don't play by our rules, and even if we, don't technically care about them that much. So what has this resulted in? Well, an attempt to get everyone to believe like, if some immigration is fine or even good, more immigration is better. And nobody's believed it. If you
Yeah.
do polls throughout Europe after World War II, Europeans are the most generous in the world toward immigrants. And yet, even still, what you see is the majority opposes mass migration. Even in the most liberal cosmopolitan countries in the world, Sweden in the 1970s, you still had a majority of people opposing mass migration. And
Mm.
now that number is going up, and political leaders are panicking, as you know, right? What unites Trump and Millet, and well, maybe not Millet, but all of these leaders rising in Europe? What unites them is the number one thing that people want out of them is stop mass migration. And then number two, let's play by fair rules with China.
Well,
If China's exploiting us, stop it.
this whole thing is just a giant lesson in wanting to have your cake and eat it too, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
You have an
so, and
inherently
yeah,
like self-terminating uh feedback loop with
yeah, exactly.
pathological altruism.
And as the elites push back against our attempt, our meaning like normal people attempt to sort of say, look, there are limits to this. Like, we do care about our own tribe.
Mm.
The more elites push back, the more it puts them in a position where they have to engage in censorship and even political violence and really strange alliances, right? So the Vox Party
Mm.
won a big election last year in Spain. They won by a narrow margin, but they did win, and it was on this one issue, right, of deporting mass, illegal immigrants. And what happens? The left stays in power by uniting themselves in Spain with literal separatists, anarchists, and communists.
Right.
So the left-wing party would unite itself with people who quite literally are pledged to the destruction of the Spanish people. And they do that in order to hang on to power. And what is the one issue that they're fighting over? Mass migration. So I think we're at a point now where actually for the first time in the last 75 years, we are going to see a resurgence of nationalism and even ethno and religious nationalism. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it shows we've been pushing up against the limits of
Mm.
of extending altruism indefinitely.
Am I
And
allowed
this
to
is
say
just evidence that you
parasites?
can't do it.
Am I allowed
What's
to say
that?
am I allowed to say parasites? It does seem like an alliance of the parasites.
Yeah, I mean, like, you can look at it that way, sure.
I mean, you have groups coming in that are taking resources from their host countries, not giving as much back. And
Yeah,
then you have them aligned with anarchist communists who want the destruction of the country,
yeah,
basically to pilfer the coffers of the society that they exist in, that is, you know,
right.
generated them.
And
Um,
separatists, I mean, we're
yeah.
talking about this, not destruction in any moralized sense. I mean, a
Mm,
separatist by definition wants the country to split. That's
yes.
what the Basque separatists want.
Right.
That's their
Right.
stated goal. So the
Mm,
left is now aligned with people who literally pledged the destruction of Spain in order to save this alliance so that we can somehow continue to try to push people to be more altruistic than they feasibly can be.
mm,
And I'll go through the final way in which people have proposed cosmopolitan liberals, that is indefinitely extending altruism, and that is through, this is something your listeners definitely won't have heard of, and that's moral bioenhancement. Of course, that's my other area that I write in, genetic enhancement and so on. So this is kind of a bit of a niche topic, but it will become a big topic soon, especially after some companies launch here that are going to be able to manipulate these kinds of traits, cognitive traits, personality traits, which underlie, of course, moral behavior. Some people have said, Julian Savulescu, for example, the head of the Center for Practical Ethics at Oxford, very influential philosopher, friend of
mm,
mine, he's argued against me. Alan Buchanan at Duke has argued against me that, what we should do is before we even allow cognitive enhancement, we should have moral enhancement. And what do they define that as? Increasing altruism in the sense of justice. Now, apart from the difficulties of defining those, I write a lot about that. I don't want to get into the details here, but we kind of understand what they mean there. And I've argued that this is actually quite a dangerous strategy because unless everyone, engineered their kids at once to have like similar levels of altruism, if you wanted to engineer your kid to have more than average, you're setting them up
mm,
to be, and I'll use your word, parasitized quite
mm,
quite literally by psychopaths and by people with very low levels of altruism, or people who are looking for people who don't have a sense of reciprocity. So there are people in the world where you'll offer a kind of olive branch and they'll take that branch and they'll break it over your head and take your stuff. And
mm,
unless you're willing to mete out punishment to those people, you have a sense of reciprocity, and you're willing to have some, or you're endowed with some level of emotions like vengeance, right? Unless you have those things, by enhancing altruism in the sense of just trusting behavior or giving behavior, you're actually making the world a worse place for your kid, and you're endangering the world for conditional cooperators, which is what we want the median person to be. Someone who is cooperative with cooperators,
mm,
and someone who is vengeful and who actually enjoys punishing defectors.
mm,
Because that's the kind of evolutionary psychology that most of us are endowed with.
mm. And it's stable for institutional and social
Is
development.
stable, exactly. And if anyone who has read the literature on this, there's a famous book called The Evolution of Cooperation by Axelrod, 1981. Had really world famous contributors from game theory, biology, etc., mathematicians, computer programmers. And what they found, roughly speaking, is of the many strategies in a iterated prisoner's dilemma tournament, the one that's most robust is conditional cooperation.
Mm,
If you try to unconditionally cooperate, eventually you're going to get exploited by parasites. And if you unconditionally defect, that is, if you're never willing to cooperate, you don't get all of those prizes that you get when you engage in joint ventures.
mm.
When you hunt together and share the meat, when you
Yeah.
wage war together and you share the prize there, that's the most stable strategy. So,
Mm. So setting aside, the likelihood, degree, precision with which we could do moral bioenhancement,
yeah,
you have this fundamental game theoretic problem built into, if I make my kids super cooperators, what are they going to do when they run into defectors?
exactly. And
Um,
and the point from Axelrod, sorry to interrupt here,
mm,
but it's really important. It not only sets your kid up for failure, if you could do this, this is all thinking 20 years, 50 years in the future. You can't really do this just through mere embryo selection, but if you could radically gene edit your kids or something, you're not only setting them up for failure, you're setting the world up for failure, right? The worst thing you can do in the world right now, for example, is you find a psychopath and you reward them, right? Like this is all you're doing is giving them more victims, right? And they're going to have more offspring. And
Yes.
I'm using the psychopath as a metaphor, but I mean, it's barely a metaphor. It is an evolutionary strategy to propagate genes. And
Mm.
people who are more toward that end of the spectrum are going to actively proliferate if there are more people who are so-called bioenhancing their kids for morality, if by what we mean by that is giving them just more altruism in some generic sense.
Mm. So that's interesting because there is a third way where you could actually give them a very robust profile.
Yes.
But and maybe that's the ultimate conclusion of enlightened tribalism, at least on that angle. There's an
Yeah.
interesting quote from this paper that I pulled out that's really stuck with me a lot lately. Just because I think it points to a serious consideration that sort of underlies this entire discussion, which is the following. Instead of focusing on what kinds of institutions make people wealthy at a certain point in history, we should ask whether these institutions can last for a long time because they help people survive and reproduce. Ultimately, this is about survival and reproduction and what institutions will be around in the future because the people that created them will be around in the future. Is it not?
Exactly. Yeah. And this is also a very politically incorrect point, but it's a straightforward implication of this idea of gene culture coevolution, which people like Richard Boyd and Joseph Henrich at Harvard, many people have read their books, and even outside of academia. For example, The Weirdest People in the World, which is about weirdness, Western educated, rich, industrialized, democratic. These people are famous for coming up with some theories about how, look, first, what happens is you get a kind of cultural mutation, and cultures change practices. It could be a religion, it could be a set of rules. And then that itself has genetic consequences. It determines who's attractive, who's worth breeding with, right? Is it the most successful hunter? Is it the one that has the most kills in
Mm.
terms of other people or animals? Actually, that's the traditional way. Or is it actually the nice one?
Mm.
Christianity probably genetically pacifies the Vikings by making altruistic people more attractive, which is remarkable, right? For a Viking to think like, oh, the nicest guy is going to win.
Mm.
Well, this is an example where it's clear if your institutions change, if your religion changes, if your norms change, that ultimately will change the gene frequencies in the population. And similarly, in the reverse direction, this is the thing that a lot of these writers won't discuss because it's so taboo in modern academia. But, if the people who comprise a nation create those institutions and sustain them, and if you swap them out for other people, it's not entirely clear that those institutions or practices are going to stay the same. And I'm not going to get myself into trouble by naming names or getting too specific, but you can all fill in the blanks and think of examples of this throughout history or the modern era. Um, yeah, if you just take one set of institutions and swap out the people, it's pretty obvious you're not going to get those institutions 20 years from now. And
Mm.
I think that's really important. And I suppose that feeds into the paper in the sense that, there, if you care about your lifestyle and the kinds of, well, norms, the kinds of things, even the kinds of music that we value, the kinds of art and architecture, then you might want to be willing to stand up for your tribe. And this is where I'm going from evolution to a positive moral vision. I
Mm.
do think there is a moral virtue in defending your tribe. That tribes can be defined in various ways, religious, ethnic, etc., nationhood. But I think there's a real moral virtue there, and people should be willing to fight to continue the existence of their tribe if they
Mm.
if they care about the things that their tribe created in the past.
So let's move into the moral case for enlightened tribalism. So there are obviously different virtues that are attached to this. Um, most notably, as you've already pointed out, there's a limit to how much care you can give. There's a limit to how
Yeah.
much attention you have. I remember arguing a long time ago with professors in college about cosmopolitanism. They always framed it as cosmopolitanism versus nationalism. So
Yeah.
you had to accept that frame of the debate, but we're already outside of that. But you know, th they describe these like concentric circles of care where it's like your care is emanating out from like you and your family unit to your friends and neighbors to wider and wider groups of people. And the notion was that you could care for all of them equally. And in fact, it was unjust to
Yeah.
care for the ones closer to you more than others.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's fine to frame it as cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, but I think tribalism is a better frame because within, first of all, as you suggested, I mean, nations barely exist anymore. We still use the word, but the original word came in response to nations are comprised of a specific people, right?
Mm,
The French people, the Greeks, the Japanese. Now we sometimes use the word nation to refer to what we other times use the word country to refer to. And the truth is, a country like the United States is it's not a nation in any sense of that word, at least classically. It's not one ethnicity, one language. It's literally just a bunch of stuff going on. It's a giant Burger King
yeah.
and Walmart, mixed into one with, all the religions and so on. So yeah, it's probably better to contrast cosmopolitanism and nationalism. But yeah, in terms of
So
the
what are the,
moral
what are the
case
virtues of enlightened tribalism?
or tribalism, yeah, sorry, not
Yes.
nationalism. Yeah, what are the virtues? I mean, I think for one thing, we can think of the meaning that comes from living among a group and fighting for that group, right? And it can be as simple as your neighborhood church, like what gives an old widow, the sort of stereotypical grandmother who, her husband has died or kids are out of the house, like what does she typically want to do? Go serve the church, serve the community. I
Mm,
mean, what else would she live for, right? If you put her in an old folks home, she's going to want to, commit suicide. But if she has a church to care for, if she has grandchildren to care for, if she has, a community to care for, it gets her out of bed in the morning. And that's true of all of us. That's just one simple example. And when you look at, people's attitudes toward children in states like the United States, they're often like, yeah, I don't really even see the point. Because like for them, life has been just about having just experiences and like cruising around and getting different kinds of jobs and hanging out. And there's no sense of identity. And there's no coincidence that as we lose meaning from community, from tribe, and so on, depression goes up, fertility goes down. And so if there's some, again, virtue in continuity among your society, it requires fertility and that requires a sense of meaning.
mm,
Meaning it also gives you an intrinsic sense that life is worthwhile. I suppose another virtue is self-sacrifice for a group. It's hard to imagine getting the kind of satisfaction out of sacrifice if you're sacrificing for everyone who's ever lived and could possibly live, right? Like I don't really care what, I'm in Austin like you are, and there's a
mm,
bunch of homeless people outside of me. I care about the homeless. Like I'd prefer they, whatever, have better lives and so on. But like, I'm not thinking of what the homeless guy downstairs thinks of me when I'm writing this paper. He doesn't think of me at all, to quote Don Draper,
yeah.
and I don't care, to be honest. It doesn't matter to me.
Mm,
But I really care about what my friends think,
mm,
about people who I respect, like whether they think I'm a bad person or a good person, whether they respect my academic work. And this is completely normal. Everyone knows this is part of our psychology, but they don't always make the connection that the more you emphasize liberal cosmopolitanism, you're just an individual among others. You need to
mm,
stamp out this sense of caring for a unique tribe. The more they create the conditions where you actually do become a worse person. You have nothing to fight for. You just, watch porn and eat pot brownies and just like, I don't know, do whatever you feel like for the day.
mm,
So as you can see, it actually literally makes you a worse person if you follow through on, at least in my view, what your professors told you. And of course, they told me the same thing. I was a student at Berkeley studying philosophy. Of course, we studied, these ideas in the 90s that we should be promoting multiculturalism and you know, kind of world community and so on. And I don't know, I didn't even have strong feelings then, but
Yeah.
when you really follow these things through their logical conclusions, it's not neutral, let alone good. It's actively evil.
Yes.
It's actively producing a worse world.
Hmm. And not only so there's deep consequences for the loss of meaning on an individual level.
Yeah,
Um, there's also deep consequences on like a humanity, like a socio-cultural level, civilizational level, even in terms of the kinds of societies and the differences between human beings that could exist. You have
yeah,
a kind of flattening of the world where you're
yeah.
actually stamping out all the diverse cultures, all the interesting places. You know, I was traveling the world a couple of years ago, and there's basically like every major city in the world, you can find at least some corners where you wouldn't be able to tell that you're not in an American city. There's a Starbucks and a McDonald's, and you can
Absolutely.
go to H&M, and it's just like, okay, what was the point of getting here again? Like,
Like, I'll just give the example. I'm here in Austin where you are right now. I split
mm,
my time here in Quito, but where I stay in Quito, I feel guilty about it because it is in like the quarter that is completely unrecognizably Ecuadorian. Just looks
yeah,
like any city, but I stay there because it's just got all the amenities. So for
yeah,
me,
it's
it's like
nice,
it's
you know.
easier and there's less crime or whatever. But
Mm,
I'm hyper aware. Like this is so boring, you know. Like they even have the equivalent of a Walmart called Mega Maxi, and it's just like ugly and horrible and generic. But it's like it is cheap, you know. And so we all sort of recognize like there are benefits, at least temporarily, to this sort of thing,
the
but
paramount
huge
example of this,
costs.
the paramount example of this would be Japan, right?
Yeah,
Where you have this tremendously unique, interesting culture that's barely replicated almost anywhere else.
yeah,
And it's in part due to their long isolation from
yep.
everything else, their
That's
inherent
it.
isolation of this island. Um, or
Yeah, and
yeah,
this is a really good point because when you think about this, like historically, obviously group selection was operating for forever. I mean, because we were isolated. And why were we isolated? Literal, just like mountain ranges, rivers, and there were fewer humans, so like vast distances between, and simply technology, just having airplanes and cars and boats, you know, and making them so cheap. All of this came out of Europe, of course, in the last 150 years, but now an African can just jump on this boat and just like go to Italy just at will.
hmm.
And it's just, it's wild. Like we haven't caught up. We have a kind of evolutionary mismatch where one culture invents these things that actually facilitate its own demise by, you know, allowing the whole world to just come in and just like do whatever it wants. And it's just kind of like, wait, what's going on here? And by the time it catches up, it's like, wow, oh, okay, I guess Swedes are going to be a minority in their own country, like after 40 years of immigration or whatever. It's like completely wild. These are new forces that just weren't, this couldn't have been possible in history up until really 50 to 100 years ago.
Hmm.
So, as you said, I think it's a good way to emphasize the virtue of enlightened tribalism. The reason it's important is real diversity. And by real diversity, I mean distinct groups that are interesting in their own ways. You know, I'm not Swiss, I'm not Japanese, but I love those countries, right? They're beautiful people,
Hmm.
beautiful cultures. Real diversity requires a rejection of cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan liberalism. It requires an acceptance of tribalism of some kind. And I think that's an extremely important point. So the people who claim most to care about, you know, diversity and this sort of thing are the ones that are actively stamping it out in the world.
Hmm. And so, what is the ultimate sort of tagline for the positive vision of enlightened tribalism? If you could sum it up in.
Okay, well, let me actually just say this. I'll quote Jonathan Haidt. He's always a safe guy to quote.
Hmm.
He thinks in similar ways to me, although his conclusions are quite different. And, you know, I don't think he's woken up politically enough yet. He's too worried about his own reputation. But
Hmm.
he has some great lines in The Righteous Mind, which I'm sure your audience will have heard of or read. And he's talking about tribalism because that's the point of the book, right? It has various implications for politics. And he sort of says, look, I mean, tribalism is not necessarily mutually destructive. It can be mutually good. And here is the quote. He says, whatever traits make a group more efficient at procuring food and turning it into children makes the group more fit than its neighbors, obviously. Group selection pulls for cooperation, for the ability to suppress antisocial behavior and to spur individuals to act in ways that benefit their groups. Group-serving behaviors sometimes impose a terrible cost on outsiders, as in warfare. But in general, groupishness is focused on improving the welfare of the in-group, not on harming the out-group. And I think that is both correct as anthropology and as having moral implications that are really important. And that is to say, yes, we should not be promoting sort of needless aggression to the outgroups, not only because it's unnecessary and, you know, we can morally say it's bad to engage in genocide, but also because it hurts us. It hurts our group in many cases, not always, but in many cases. World War II is the perfect example. Again, the ultimate losers of World War II are Germany and Japan. You know, and it's not because nationalism is necessarily bad. It's because that form of it, that extraordinarily aggressive and violent form of it, just it is likely it will unite the rest of the world against you and be self-defeating. So yeah, the ultimate tagline for this is to say we need to really construct political institutions that are compatible with our nature and help us express our nature, but also hopefully be aware that there are good and bad forms of that, and that rather than fighting our nature, which is what the post-World War II order has been about, we should kind of sublimate our nature. And ultimately, we argue in the paper, and I think this is true, that it's conceivable that all groups, certainly most groups, can benefit from a universal nationalism. So it sounds paradoxical, but when every group more or less looks out primarily for its interests, not exclusively, but primarily, it can be good for that group and for other groups. Whereas when we have an institution like the US, which fights wars to spread our ideology to people who don't want it, you know, like, who are we helping there, right? We're killing our own people in those wars. We're brainwashing our own citizens and brainwashing and destroying other cultures that are distinct from ours. So if that's your view of the world, you know, good riddance. Like, I think that's a terrible view of the world. I promote real diversity and real cosmopolitanism in the sense that the world should be made up of different cosmos. It should be made up of different communities, and this is a good thing.
All right, Johnny. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Alex. Really good to talk to you.